You guys have all seen the headlines. The dollar is dying. Saudi Arabia, Iran, China, they're all trying to de-dollarize, and there's a ton of BRICS nations that are trying to de-dollarize as well. Now, what does this mean? What does this mean for you? What does it mean for me? Does it mean that we're going to have hyperinflation tomorrow? I want to go through this article here and then show you this video from George Gammon, and he kind of lays it out pretty well in succinct fashion, way better than I can. I want to go through that video with you. So let's take a look at this article here from Zero Hedge. Here's some of the things that have happened over the last, 2 years or so. Here are 7 signs the global de-dollarization has shifted into overdrive. And this is definitely true. The world is trying to de-dollarize. Okay, so number 1, the BRICS nations account for over 40% of the total global population and close to 1/4 of global GDP. So the fact that they are working to develop a new currency should greatly concern all of us. Agree with that. And the question is why? The question is why. I think they're operating in their own self-interest since it's not a neutral reserve currency. But it's a lot harder to start a reserve currency than people think. Okay, number 2, two of the BRICS nations, China and Brazil, have just reached a deal to trade in their own currencies. Okay, also not the dollar. Not bullish for the dollar. During the meeting last week in Indonesia, finance ministers from ASEAN nations discussed ways to reduce dependence on the US dollar, euro, yen, and British pound. Number 4, the move that has enormous implications to the petrodollar. Saudi Arabia, this is huge, just agreed to become a dialogue partner with Shanghai Cooperation Organization. In other words, sell oil from Saudi Arabia in one. The Chinese just completed their very first trade of liquefied natural gas that has settled in Chinese currency instead of US dollars. Number 6, the government of India is offering their currency as an alternative to the US dollar in international trade. And number 7, Saudi Arabia has actually agreed to accept Kenyan shillings as payment for oil shipments to Kenya instead of US dollars. All those headlines tell me, okay, they, they want to de-dollarize. But how quickly does that happen? And logistically, what does that look like? Where do all the dollars go when they de-dollarize? So for that, let's take a look at what George Gammon had to say. I'm going to pause him a couple times just to give my perspective, but he lays it out really well in this Q&A, so I'll give it to him.
What if China begins requiring that all trade with China and Chinese businesses be transacted in digital yuan instead of US dollars? I mean, I think the probability of this is very low, but I mean, what you're asking is, would the dollar implode? And the answer is no. So pretty simple answer. If you want more detail, I did I'll actually probably do a whiteboard video on this week, because I know a lot of people are talking about the BRICS starting a new currency, and is this the end of the dollar? The dollar is going to implode, and all these dollars are going to come flooding back to the United States because they're no longer needed for global trade, and yada yada yada. This is very, like, what would be a nice way to talk about or to explain that narrative? It's a very shallow. The thinking involved with that narrative is incredibly shallow. Why? Because how were these dollars outside? Let's say that there's dollars that would have been used, say, outside of the United States, that would have been used for transacting with the Chinese. Okay, well, how were those dollars created? They're not green pieces of paper. They were loaned into existence, right? So let's just say that there's $50 trillion
through the euro dollar system he's referring to.
On the asset side of the balance sheet, in aggregate total outside of the United States, that $50 trillion could come flooding back in. That's the narrative, right? Okay, well, there's also $50 trillion plus interest in debt that created that 50 trillion. Okay, so let's just say that that entrepreneur or that corporation no longer needs those dollars that are on their balance sheet. Okay, great. Well, what are they going to do? They've still got that debt, so they're most likely going to pay down the debt. And if they pay down the debt, what happens to the amount of dollars in circulation? It decreases. And you say, okay, George, well, what if they don't pay off the debt? Okay, well, then their bank goes bust, and anyone that had dollar deposits with that bank, now that money's completely gone. Say, okay, well, what if they choose not to pay it off immediately and they buy assets in the United States because they don't want those dollars anymore because they're hot potatoes? Okay, fine. Well, then they buy real estate in the United States, and that person takes those dollars, pays off their debt, and that decreases the amount of dollars. So you can just go around and around and around and around. But the people who talk about the dollar imploding or whatever, they're only looking at the asset side of the balance sheet. They're not looking at the liability side of the balance sheet. That's why I say it's kind of shallow thinking. You got to realize that the majority of dollars, the majority of fiat currency out there is loaned into existence, which creates more demand for that currency in the future, especially if velocity slows down. So you say, okay, George, well, how do you get a Turkey? How do you get an Argentina? How do you get this type of inflation or loss of purchasing power relative to other fiat currencies then? Well, then there's two more ways to create currency units, right? If the central bank does it by, let's say, monetizing the debt, and then they're buying debt from the private sector, which increases the amount of currency units, and that would be applicable to any bank. So just the central bank or a bank like Goldman Sachs, as an example, buying from non-bank entities, that increases M2 money supply as well. Or the government just quite literally printing new green pieces of paper like they did in 1862 to fund the Civil War, which was when they implemented the Legal Tender Act.
So today, this would include things like paying off people's college loans, because that is buying their debt so they don't have that on their liabilities. Individuals don't. Therefore, they're able to spend into the real economy. That's being challenged today. Or things like UBI. So it doesn't mean we're not going to have inflation, because inflation is very complicated. There's a supply side too, which as money becomes more expensive and funding becomes more scarce from banks, supply is probably going to go down. But I don't think we're going to see hyperinflation because of this de-dollarization and what George is saying. They're not coming back on shore. So let's keep listening.
Which had nothing to do with the central bank. We didn't have a central bank back then. It's just the government literally printing green piece of paper, printing M2 money supply. That's another way to do it, right? So then you've got to say, okay, well, how is that going to happen in the United States? Maybe it will, but then let's just say they print $10 trillion, right, of green pieces of paper and just do a helicopter drop. Okay, well, how do those dollars get outside the United States? Well, George, we have these huge trade deficits. Okay, let's say they're 100 billion a month. That's 1.2 trillion a year. All right, let's think about what the global economy is. 104 trillion in GDP. And then how many of those transactions are settled in dollars? Let's say 60%. Okay, you got 60 or 65 trillion that are settled in dollars. So that means there's at least 100 trillion on the balance sheets of when you consider the banking entities and the non-banking entities in the global economy. All right, so then you've got $1 trillion a year. Let's say you've got 2%. All right, well, if the economy slows down, the global economy, that means fewer currency units are going to be lent into existence, more loans being paid off. So even though $1 trillion is getting outside the United States, the amount of dollars in aggregate total that are circulating are actually going down. So I'm not saying that you're not going to have inflation in the United States. That's a completely different topic, because you got to look at the United States domestic dollar and the supply demand, the supply of stuff. And then you've got to look at the supply of dollars relative to global denominated debt. And then you got to look at that as far as other fiat currencies to determine what the dollar is going to do against those currencies. It's a much different question than what's the dollar going to do relative to goods and services in the United States. You see, and that's the nuance that's just kind of missing with that argument. Now, I could give you a few different ways that the dollar could go down on the DXY against other fiat currencies, but that would require the global economy to really heat up and the velocity of those dollars to go up dramatically. It would require the other global central banks to continue to increase interest rates, and the United States taking their interest rates down to zero. And this is in the face of potentially a global economic recession or depression. And although short term, I could definitely see that. Long term, that's going to be tough. That's going to be tough. And then the question becomes, okay, well, George, how far down does the dollar go? It's at 100 now, 90, 80, 70. Okay, well, it could lose 30%, and that still takes us right back to where we were in 2011. So, and last time I checked, the dollar was still the reserve currency in 2011. Right? So why? And would it go down much more than that? It would be tough. It would be tough. So that's I think what you're getting at with that question. Again, can the dollar go down? Or I think it will go down versus goods and services. Will it go down against other currencies? Maybe. My base case is it will not go down that much, if it does at all, over the next year. And does it get down to 70 or lower? There's always a possibility. But in the next few years, I think the probability of that is pretty darn low, especially if you believe that we're going to go into a global recession, because in that scenario, that's actually dollar bullish.
All right. So well, I thought he laid that out pretty well. What George is saying is the DXY, so the dollar versus other currencies, and the dollar here in the United States versus goods and services, you should kind of think of those in two different facets, because yes, the dollar's going down versus eggs, the dollar's going down versus groceries versus real estate. There's a lot of things. And in order for us, this is why I'm not thinking we're going to get hyperinflation anytime soon, is because we need, and this would be your signpost, like, things are happening when they start monetizing debt from the private sector, or the Fed starts directly monetizing, which they kind of have, monetizing government debt. Because let's think about it. We can't afford. So one of the things that is happening is there's going to be less demand for treasuries. But on the other side of that balance sheet, if governments around the world want to de-dollarize, therefore they don't want to save in dollars. Another way of saying that is they don't want to buy treasuries. That means interest rates on treasuries go up. But the problem with the treasuries they already hold is the same problem that SVB had, which is if they sold them on the open market, if let's say Japan has trillions of dollars in treasuries, they're going to take a massive loss on those because the interest rate they bought them at was much lower. So they're going to have a huge cost to sell those. So the question is, will they? I don't know. If they have to defend the yen, potentially. And the same thing with China. China's going to take a massive loss. All the countries that own treasuries are going to take a massive loss. So I don't think they're going to just start selling trillions of dollars of treasuries overnight. But there is less demand for those treasuries. So what happens? It might work out over time, and I think this is the trend we're going on. This is why I think it's important. The trend is people are de-dollarizing. The trend is the dollar is losing value. Now, if those interest rates go up and there's no one to sell them to, no one wants to buy them, or at least there's not enough demand, and we're running a deficit of $2 trillion because of the interest rates that we have to pay, who's going to buy that? Will it eventually be the Fed? Because at the end of the day, the Fed's not taking dollars from the free market to purchase those treasuries. They're printing them. So that $2 trillion deficit, let's say it's to fund Social Security. If you think about it, let's say we have a $6 trillion budget, and $2 trillion of that is Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, and we have to deficit spend to do that, and we can, and by deficit spend, I mean sell treasuries, and no one wants to buy them. Therefore, the Fed steps in and buys them. They are literally printing money to hand $2 trillion to the federal government, who then hands it to the private sector through Social Security. because they're not taking enough taxes out of the system to diffuse into the economy, if that makes sense. So is this trend going to continue? My opinion, yes, because interest rates keep going up. But that doesn't mean hyperinflation. And a lot of these countries around the world are in a worse position than we are. Because, like I said, it's very hard to sell these treasuries at a loss, and they have a deficit as it is too. And look at France. France is trying to raise the retirement age. Why do you think that is? Their balance sheet is messed up. So I don't think overnight you're going to have this. Okay, we're done using the dollar. Let's start using Chinese currency, because there's a lot of trust that is broken down, and ultimately, the United States has become an entity that people can't trust, which is why Saudi Arabia is looking for different partners, and other countries around the world looking for different partners. Regardless of what you think about it, the United States came in and literally took, I think it was $600 billion worth of Russian assets because they invaded Ukraine. That doesn't seem neutral to me. So it's a neutral reserve currency. You probably shouldn't do that. So yes, I think the trend's going to continue, but doesn't mean hyperinflation in the United States. Doesn't mean all these dollars are going to onshore again. I don't think so. So if you're looking for hyperinflation, look for Fed monetizing more debt, paying off private sector debt by the Treasury, things like college loans, and UBI. So if they're printing money to put it into the real economy, meaning you and me, get that money, and that money wasn't taken out of the economy in the first place, that's how you get more and more higher inflation. And we always got to think about the supply side too. So even if dollars are shrinking, the supply side is shrinking even more, you're still going to get inflation. Let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I think he did a pretty good job of nuancing why this is the case. And I agree with everything he just said. All right, guys, I'll see you on the next one. Peace.